for Change podcast. Today we're speaking with Nicole Schmitt, Executive Director of the Alaska Wildlife Alliance. Alaska Wildlife Alliance was founded in 1978 to be a voice for Alaska's wildlife, which includes marine mammals and endangered species. The mission of AWA is to safeguard wildlife biodiversity, knowing the wildlife have not only intrinsic value to the ecosystems, but to the Alaskan people as well. And in recent years, AWA has expanded its reach and partners with other environmental organizations to litigate over exploiting public lands and waters in Alaska by extraction industries. I am so forward to listening to what you have to bring to us today. Thank you, Nicole, for being here with us.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
I appreciate it. I appreciate the time that you are giving to us right now and everything you're going to shed light on for us about Alaska and its wildlife and all of the nature that's in that beautiful area. But first, I would like to start off with, can you share with us how you got your start with Alaska Wildlife Alliance and what does your job entail?
Yeah, well, um, I first learned about Alaska Wildlife Alliance in 2013. I was working in a seasonal capacity at the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge doing a GIS project, a mapping project, about wildlife and the interactions between private lands and public lands and how wildlife moved across those. And at the time, the refuge managers decided to close brown bear hunting on the refuge because there had basically been an overharvest of brown bears, to use that regulatory language, in the area. And these bears are pretty segregated from other bear populations. There are big mountains that act as a natural barrier, and so there's not a lot of cross-pollination between these brown bears. They're distinct. And the refuge had a meeting where it explained the closure. And at the closure, there were a lot of people very upset who wanted to continue hunting brown bears and wanted to hunt brown bears on the refuge lands. And I attended just to listen and learn more about it. And there were only a couple voices in the room that spoke up in support of the closure and in support of brown bears. And one of those was the executive director at the time of Alaska Wildlife Alliance. And I was so intrigued by the organization because in these regulatory spaces, there are many people who are seeking what we would call allocation of wildlife for their interests, to sport hunt or trophy hunt, or they just don't like brown bears and they don't want them around. Those are often the voices in that room. And it was really refreshing and made me feel better about the process, having an organization like Alaska Wildlife Alliance in that space advocating for wildlife. And so that was my introduction to the organization. And I came on as the executive director in 2018. And my role is, for those who work in nonprofits, everyone wears multiple hats, but I oversee our programs and our fundraising. And I've come on a bit of a journey about what this role is and what this looks like, what effective wildlife advocacy looks like. And one of my mentors said, Nikki, wildlife management and wildlife advocacy isn't really about wildlife. It's about people management and advocating to people. And I didn't believe that for so long. And I'm really coming around to that we're such a powerful species. Our impact can be so great. And so I've really adjusted my thinking about this role and this work as to how we can build relationships with people and restore relationships between people and their environment and their wildlife neighbors. And so I spend a lot of time doing that. I used to think that these regulations and decisions were made on best available science, be it Western science or traditional ecological knowledge, but it's really made by people with different values and agendas. And so we spend a lot of time working with people.
Wow. So when you say working with people, you're working with legislation, you're working with indigenous peoples, you're working with people who want to allocate bears and other wildlife, and trying to um, be on the same footing, I guess, with everyone.
Yeah, it's tricky. So we're a 501(c)(3) organization, so we don't lobby. We can't, you know, lobby in the halls of the legislature, but we do a lot of education for people, community members, about what the impacts of their votes are, how the political systems touch wildlife management. And then, yeah, working with partners, some of them seem very natural and others seem kind of surprising. So we've worked with hunting organizations on issues where we see overlap in, for example, wanting more wildlife troopers or wanting to reduce poaching. And so there's been overlap there. We've also been working really hard to improve and expand our relationships with Native communities um, around subsistence issues, and also just this notion of holistic management. Our mission is really at the core of it. It sounds a bit jargony, but it's ecosystem based management. And I say management kind of with air quotes, but approaching how we interact with wildlife on an ecosystem, with an ecosystem view. So not managing for a single species, for a single user, for a single outcome, but saying, how can we improve this ecosystem as a whole, and all the people who are interested in taking part of that ecosystem. We find ourselves building partnerships and alliances um, to help make that process more holistic.
So, can you give an example of what that would look like?
Yeah, gosh. I think I might give an example. Well, let me give some context, I guess, about how some of these regulations come into practice. So for the state of Alaska, we have this entity called the Board of Game. And Alaska's state constitution has a clause that says that wildlife and other resources are managed in sustained yield. So that's kind of the standard that our constitution set. And to meet that requirement of sustained yield, they created what's called the Board of Game. And there's also the Board of Fish. And it's mindful to note that it's called the Board of Game and not the Board of Wildlife.
I was just gonna add
Yes,
that. Yeah.
yes, yeah. And that's, reflects the priority that the creators of that system had for game. And game is more about human interest in consuming a wildlife or a fur bearer. Um, and so most hunters, myself included, I have a hunting license. Um, I used to think that the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, being the scientific entity of the state, made decisions around what the population objectives would be. So how many wolves in a certain area would they deem to be enough wolves to be sustainable, or how many caribou, or how many moose. I thought that they made the decisions on how long hunting and trapping seasons would be, so you could, stay within those parameters, or what methods of hunting and trapping would be most humane, or have the least impact on the population. But in reality, all of those decisions, population objectives, season lengths, methods and means, who can hunt, they're made by this board called the Board of Game. And the Board of Game is a politically appointed board. There are no designated seats for scientists or Alaska Natives. They are nominated by the governor and confirmed by the legislature. It's a 7-member board and they serve 3-year terms. So if you look at the composition of the Board of Game right now, it very much reflects the interests of our current governor. 6 of the 7 members are big game guides, wildlife hunting guides. There's 1 Alaska Native, and there are no scientists on the board. And so that is the entity who is making all the decisions for How many wolves should exist? How many Alexander Archipelago wolves should we shoot to have in Southeast Alaska? It's the only place in Alaska where those wolves live. How many caribou do you think we should have in X herd? What should the season length be for brown bears on the Kenai Peninsula, and who gets to hunt them? All those decisions are made by those political appointees. And so the board is advised by Alaska Department of Fish and Game. They're also advised by local advisory committees, who are people who are just interested in wildlife regulations. But when the board puts forward a call for proposals, anyone in Alaska can write a proposal for wildlife management. I can say, I want to extend the season for beaver trapping. I can write that in a proposal, and it's submitted and taken up by the Board of Game. When that happens and we see those proposals, that's when we take a look at what people are wanting, and we try and mobilize the public to support proposals that are really good for wildlife, oppose proposals that are really bad for wildlife, work with other organizations to see if we can find strength in coming together in support or opposition of a proposal. If we can write proposals together that are, helping us reach an end for wildlife. So I have a couple of examples of Board of Game processes that I think could sort of put this into perspective. One is interesting because it's not really a wildlife issue per se, but it pertains to trapping. And per Alaska state regulations, trappers do not have to label their traps. There are no setbacks from trails, parking lots, or roads. They are not required to mark their traps with their name or even put a flag that trapping exists. And they're not required to check their traps. So a lot of states have requirements.
They're not required to check them?
They're not required to check their traps. So in many, and this is on state lands, there are other rules for example, the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge allows trapping, but it's stricter. They have to label their traps, and they have to check their traps. And there are a couple of other regulations, but for state lands, which are vast, and many of those state lands have agreements with national forests. So Chugach National Forest, for example, is practically managed by state wildlife rules. So yes, you don't have to check your traps. So you could set your trap out on the start day in November and come back at the end of March. Totally legal. And the problem that we've been seeing, obviously, there are really troubling impacts for wildlife. Incidental take of moose being caught in leg hold traps and snares. Species that you're not trying to catch, but that they do. Right. And dogs. A lot of dogs are caught on these traps. We put forward a proposal based on community outcry from our membership to have 50-yard setbacks from traps from trails, because people would be going out skiing on these designated ski trails. And for example, one of our board members' dog was caught and killed in a baited conibear trap 30 feet from the parking lot of the trailhead.
Wow.
This last year, behind the elementary school in Homer, there's a trail system, and 4 dogs were caught on trails leading out of that system. So we've put forward proposals asking for trap setbacks from these trails, and the Board of Game has denied them.
For what reason, though? I mean, this is a detriment to the public as well.
Correct. Yeah, it's murky. Some of them say, well, this would be too hard to regulate, which I have a hard time believing, because there are some setback regulations in Juneau. It's the only area of state lands where there are designated setbacks, and those are a quarter mile from trails. So we asked,
so they're already doing it. Yeah.
Yes, but there's just the composition of the board right now. We had one board member this round vote to support it, but all the others refused. Basically, the argument that I've heard the most is, well, this is a slippery slope. If trappers give an inch, you're going to take a mile, and this is the start to banning trapping in the state. And so it just really reflects if the Board of Game had a composition that was not so heavily catered towards the interests of Alaska Trappers Association, for example, which it currently has 2 members of the 7 members of the board are members of that organization.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's just a hard place to advocate for wildlife when the composition is so skewed. We had 500 comments in support of our first proposal. There were multiple proposals that came up this last year with over 300 proposals or comments in support of those. Community groups in support. The Forest Service wrote a letter of support, and yet many of those setbacks were rejected.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think there's another example that is actually, it's wearing heavy on my mind because it starts tomorrow. And at this last Board of Game meeting in March, the board announced a predator control program on wolves and bears in Southwest Alaska on the Mulchatna caribou herd. So that's a lot of words, and I'll explain what that means. But there's a law in Alaska called the Intensive Management Law that allows agencies, when an intensive management program is authorized, to do things like habitat intervention and predator control. And predator control is state-sponsored aerial gunning or gassing of predators. So it's paid state employees shooting wolves and bears from helicopters, gassing wolf dens, bear dens, things like that.
For what reason? Are they saying that they are killing off too many caribou?
Correct. It's for the
Are there
purpose.
even enough bear and wolves to do this aerial gunning and gassing?
Great. Yes. All good questions. Yes. So the purpose of predator control is to reduce the number of predators so that you can increase the number of ungulates, usually moose or caribou, sometimes deer. And this is again an example of how the system of management in Alaska is very much focused on a single species, mostly on game. How can we increase caribou and moose? Well, one way maybe is we can decrease wolves and bears and predators. And this has been a highly controversial program since its inception. And to the extent that former Governor Tony Knowles issued a blue ribbon panel to assess whether predator control works. It has not been found in any peer-reviewed study to work, and yet it's something that we have in Alaska. And the really troubling issue about this upcoming predator control program is that the Mulchatna herd, much like many of the caribou herds in Alaska, is crashing. It used to be 80,000 animals. Then the range kind of moved to 30,000 to 80,000. Currently, there's less than 12,000 caribou in the Mulchatna herd. Yeah. And
why is that, you think? Is it just habitat loss or climate change or many other reasons, human encroachment?
Yeah. Alaska Department of Fish and Game gave a presentation on their research and findings. And there have been some joint publications with Togiak National Wildlife Refuge. So there's state and federal research going on into the collapse of this herd. And there is currently a predator control program for wolves concerning the Mulchatna herd. And last year, this would have been in 2022, Alaska Department of Fish and Game did a presentation to the Board of Game and said, our findings, I'm summarizing here, our findings are that wolves really have nothing to do with the herd collapse. It's habitat loss, mostly from climate change, and disease. These animals are very, very sick. There's a little bit of predation by bears on calves in the calving grounds, but the 3 main threats are habitat, disease, and out-of-season harvest, particularly out-of-season human harvest, humans killing female caribous outside of the regulated season.
Yeah.
And the department recommended that the Board of Game revisit the wolf control program because they basically said wolves don't have anything to do with this collapse. And some research suggested that wolves are actually helpful for the herd because they can move them along so the caribou don't eat themselves out of house and home. They
Right.
can cull diseased animals. There's an intrinsic relationship between wolves and caribou.
Right.
So that was their official recommendation. And at the last meeting, the Board of Game, to our great surprise, authorized a predator control program against the advisement of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. And starting tomorrow, until June, I believe, June 6th, so for 30 days.
That's
The
a lot of
state,
time.
yeah, the state is taking 2 fixed wings and a helicopter and aerially gunning every wolf and bear, black and brown bear, despite age class or sex.
No. So it's
It,
just, it's not even, they're going after any, and I mean, that is going to hurt the bear and the wolf population, because if you're taking down the alpha,
yeah,
how is that going to affect their reproduction? And the
and
list goes
and
on, right? I mean,
yeah, that's the difficult part. They anticipate that they'll kill between 25 or 15 to 25 bears. They're not sure about wolves. And then they're taking the hides and heads and selling them at the horn auction in Anchorage. But the salvage requirements are really low. And that's the problem when we have a focus on game. There's a lot of research on caribou, a lot of research on moose. Those species absolutely deserve that kind of attention. But there's less on bears and wolves. Some surveys in the state for bears are over 30 years old, and we don't have an accurate population estimate, so we don't really know. And it's just not as much a priority. And for wolf management, it's really interesting because there's been a movement, particularly from Denali National Park through their wolf research, to try and understand the impact of wolf family dynamics, right? Like trapping an alpha versus a non-alpha, and how that totally changes the kind of neighborhood of wolf packs in an area.
right.
And at the state level, managers just don't look at those intricacies. They're looking at the wolf population overall. And so if we say, oh, but that'll hurt the wolves in this area, the response is more wolves will come down and repopulate it. It's not a big deal. It's not taking a more granular look. And in fairness, Alaska is a huge place. This is a really hard thing to do. But there's not a lot of that conservation management principle of, if you don't know, don't manage to the absolute edge. Don't kill to the absolute edge. Leave a
Right.
buffer for things like climate change. What if there's a really hard winter? And what if there's a disease outbreak? There's just so many variables in these ecosystems.
And you don't
And
know these days, I mean, how fast things can change.
yeah, that's right. And I mean, especially for species like caribou. I mean, we're starting to see wildfires on the tundra on permafrost. I mean, it's
Oh my.
it's wild. And I think to
Wow.
I guess round this out to what AWA's mission, what really inspires me in this work and in this work with Board of Game, is that the system that we have for managing and interacting or managing wildlife in Alaska and in most Western systems is very anthro focused. We're looking at and arguing about the allocation of moose for humans. How many moose do we get to kill and who gets to have them? And those are important questions for subsistence. I'm not trying to take that away. But the problem is that there's no allocation for non-human species. We don't allocate a certain number of fish to marine mammals. We don't allocate moose to wolves or bears. We only allocate to humans. And
Right.
even the notion of humans allocating wildlife to certain users has this inherent notion of power over species, right? Like
Yeah. Speciesism.
we have the power to allocate that. And
Yeah.
so there's this really interesting model of indigenous land planning. It's called Land, Peoples, and Relationship Model. It comes out of the Yukon First Nations. And It's called the no voice perspective. And basically, the premise of this model, and I'm sure there are others who can more eloquently explain this, but when we make decisions about wildlife and habitat, the idea is that there's a round table of decision makers and people who want certain things from that decision. But at the table, there's always an empty seat for the voiceless. And the voiceless are future generations of humans. The seat is for non-humans. The seat is for, uh, plants and habitat. Basically, they call it Mother Earth. But, having that empty seat there requires, as the discussion moves forward, when there is time dedicated for that empty seat for people to think about what would that voiceless want from this discussion. And that's, I think, what I see the role, the purpose of Alaska Wildlife Alliance is. We want to make sure that there are people who are speaking for those voiceless creatures, speaking up for the wolves and the bears and the beavers and caribou. In the context of the Mulchatna herd, I really want someone on the board of game who says, let me just speak for the wolves for a moment. And I mean, I know this sounds kind of,
No,
some
it
people think it
doesn't.
sounds like hippy-dippy, but
No, it's
but
not
I think
crazy.
it's just changing the paradigm from one of ownership and entitlement to one more in reciprocity and relationships, which has historical precedence with First Nations people in Alaska. And we just need to integrate that. And so,
Yes.
in the Mulchatna context, having someone say, for someone from the wolves, they have nothing to do with this. This is wasteful. For the caribou, saying we're sick and we don't have enough food. This is not the solution. We deserve something better. Can you intervene in something that will actually help us? And so and room for the indigenous communities who rely on caribou for subsistence, and that herd has tanked. They're really suffering. And so expanding that paradigm, expanding the number of voices in the room to include wildlife is really what gets to the heart of why I'm here and what we do.
Well, and it all started when you were at that meeting and you heard AWA speak up.
Exactly. And there might not be they might not pass the proposal that you want, or you might not get that systemic change right away. But I think it's really important and a really timely. I mean, we're living in a world of so much information. We're seeing the impacts of climate change. And I think people are really starting to question, is the way that we've been doing business really working? Can we do this more holistically? And so I think it's really important to have groups like this, voices like this in those systems that are mundane and honestly not very attractive. It's hard to talk to people. Like, we go to a lot of meetings. Well, a lot of decisions are made in those meetings, and so it's not maybe as alluring as field work all the time, but it is important.
It's very important. And I think, to your point about the indigenous peoples, their traditional ecological knowledge is so valuable. I mean, they've been on these lands for so long, they understand it, they're one with nature. I mean, just having their voice, being fair representation on the, Alaska's Board of Game would be amazing. That is so disheartening to know that these 7 members are appointed by one person where the people of Alaska have no voice.
Yeah, it's and I think, I mean, the number of people in Alaska who don't know, hunters and people who are engaged and really want to know, about their food and ecosystems, people who are really well-meaning. Many have no idea the Board of Game even exists, to be honest. They think that the regulations come out in the booklet and that those regulations have been vetted against some higher standard. But I mean, I've been at Board of Game meetings. We're involved in litigation against the state and the Board of Game around a very liberalized wolf trapping season for Alexander archipelago wolves in Southeast Alaska. And being in the room when they're making the decisions of how many what's the population objective for Alexander Archipelago wolves in this area? And they'll say 200. I don't know, that seems kind of high. Some people say 250 is too many. Well, what's the minimum? Maybe 100. Okay, let's just set it between 150 and 200.
So random.
It's very random because and it's based on the values of the people who comment and engage and the people who make the decisions. And so if those values are ones that are inherently suspicious of wolves and their impact on their opportunity to hunt for deer, for example, we're likely to see lower population objectives. So there's no scientific standard, is what I'm saying,
No, there isn't.
for how these
What?
decisions are made. It's a political decision. And that's what I mean by when I say wildlife management is about people management. I keep being reminded of how important it is. And not talking political as if Republicans or Democrats or anything like that, but just the interests of those who are involved.
Right.
They have agendas, and
Right.
you have to be a part of that. And we need to have a voice for wildlife.
Well, thank you for being the voice for the wildlife and being that part of the fair representation for that empty chair, for that voiceless being.
Trying to, yes, yeah. We and we do a lot too with, at this last Board of Game meeting, we partnered with Chugach Regional Resources Commission, which is a an tribal consortium that works on tribal subsistence rights and advocacy. And we did a training for tribal members as to what the Board of Game was. We worked through proposal booklets with them, and then those tribal members testified in front of the Board of Game.
Wow.
And so just trying to get more participation in that. And then also looking at systemic changes. What can we do to make the Board of Game inherently more fair, inherently more diverse, and representative of all those interests, including non-human interests?
Right. Do you ever, does AWA have a way of sharing the intrinsic value that these species have on the ecosystem and for everybody that's involved in the area?
Yeah, intrinsic value is something that some people don't really understand, and sometimes I have a hard time understanding what we mean by intrinsic value. But
or like just how if the wildlife is preserved, does it then fall into, like, you see the ecosystems thriving? Just like, I know that wolves will call, sick animals, and how it's all interconnected in that way, how they're actually supportive of the ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk a lot about this as intact ecosystems, when an ecosystem is intact. And intact ecosystems are ones where the relationship between species and humans and those species, plants and lands and waters, are balanced. And those are the ones that are most often resilient to, temperature changes, again, like a hard winter. If that ecosystem is intact, usually species can withstand those pressures, those threats. But when an ecosystem is not intact, when those balances are thrown off, there's a lot of cascading effects, and those are very, very hard to know ahead of time. Sometimes they're hard to see in real time. We're not really sure. And so, and I think, climate is a really big destabilizing force for many of our ecosystems in Alaska. And people often think, Alaska is so big and there are so few people. We have about 700,000 people in the state. And half of them live in Anchorage. Everyone else is kind of dispersed over these small towns and villages. And so it feels like, okay, there's a lot of land, there's not a lot of people. We're good. We're going to be protected. And what we're finding is that we're really not. Climate impacts everything. We're seeing changes 3 to 4 times the rate of the lower 48. And
3 to 4 times.
3 to 4 times. Yeah.
I mean, you
Um,
mentioned that there was a wildfire in the permafrost.
many, multiple. Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
that's insanity.
It is wild. There have been a couple years ago in Bethel, which is in southwestern Alaska, salmon were having heart attacks because the river was 11 degrees warmer than it had been the previous year.
11 degrees.
11 degrees. hmm
Wow.
Um, I mean, the changes are immense. And we developed a climate adaptation program because we kind of know how much carbon, let's say, will be released into the atmosphere. We kind of know what the temperature change will be. We kind of know what that means for sea level rise. What's really hard to know are the ecological cascades
Hmm.
within ecosystems that have now been thrown off kilter. And so, through our climate adaptation planning program, we know that Alaskans, people are making adaptation plans, villages are moving, people are changing, season lengths are changing for wildlife hunting because the rut is happening later. There's all these changes happening and people are adapting. And the goal of that program is to make sure that as we make adaptation plans for humans, we absolutely have a responsibility to make adaptation plans for wildlife. And to do that, we need to know what's coming. And so
Yeah.
um, we're just in the beginning phases of a project with in partnership with the native village of Payamute and their neighboring villages of Hooper Bay, Chivak, and Scammon Bay. Um, and this project is funded through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation Coastal Resiliency Program. And they're faced with very hard decisions, these villages, about what to do. The Yukon Kuskokwim Delta is in southwest, pretty much western, but a little bit southwestern Alaska, and it's very flat. Um, it is one of the most important nesting sites for migratory birds in the world. Um, almost every emperor goose nests there. There are millions of birds that go up to those shores and nest on the Yukon Kuskokwim Delta every year. It's incredibly important biologically. And it's flooding. It's going to be salinated. That delta
Oh,
could
wow.
actually, on a map, look smaller by 2050. I mean, the climate projections are very clear about that.
Right.
And villages, there's 56 villages in that area or so. And so where are they going to move? What are they going to do? What are the birds going to do?
Yeah,
Um,
what is everyone
as
going to do?
what is everyone going to do? And so we're doing that planning because it's not just about, there's also a really strong spiritual and cultural connection to wildlife and traditional practices. And so,
Right.
some communities are saying, like, should we bring in pigs? And is that going to be our food security? Well, what about nature-based allies? How can wildlife be a part of the solution? And how can we carve out space and regulations that protect wildlife and help wildlife adapt in all of these changes? An example that's been thrown around has been there's not very much ice that's going to be left. We know that ice in important walrus migrations is declining. It's already declining, and those walrus populations are getting really close together. Could we create artificial walrus haulouts? Literally built rafts of possibly old oil and gas platforms in the middle of those migration routes so that walrus have a place to rest. I mean, like, these
Oh,
are the kinds of things that we're thinking about because the changes are happening and we feel that we have a deep sense of responsibility to help wildlife adapt in all of those changes. And so, um, a
and
big
thank you
part of
for
that is,
that.
I mean, it's a big, with a lot of power comes a lot of responsibilities. And again, humans have so much power in what we do and the changes that we're making to the world. And
Right.
and I just think we have a huge responsibility to make sure that we are helping plan for the most under-resourced people and wildlife.
And like you said, with responsibility, with great power comes this great responsibility. And what I feel is we're not taking that responsibility seriously. And but thank you and AWA for taking that step and looking forward and trying to plan and navigate how you can support the wildlife that are already suffering. They're already feeling the effects. I mean, I was reading on AWA, one of the blogs was about the Cook Inlet beluga whales, how it's a very special population, but their population is crashing.
Yeah. Yes. And yeah, gosh, the beluga whales, the plight of the Cook Inlet beluga whale is one that's very close to my heart. And I just want to make sure I have all their numbers correct. But there are 5 stocks of beluga whales in Alaska, 5 distinct populations. And one of them is the Cook Inlet beluga whale. Cook Inlet is massive. It's bigger than Chesapeake Bay. And it
Wow.
borders, it's the most heavily populated watershed in Alaska. It's right outside of Anchorage, all the way down to the Kenai Peninsula.
Wow.
And yeah, there were, so in the 1970s, there were as many as 1,300 beluga whales, Cook Inlet beluga whales. And there's actually the native village of Tyonek is kind of the beluga tribe. I mean, it was a huge subsistence cultural symbol and resource for those people. And so we went from 1,300 Cook Inlet belugas in the 1970s, and now there are less than 300. There's just been a sharp decline.
Why is
And
that?
great question. Well, in the 2008 to 2010, AWA was on the coalition to get this species listed as an endangered species, and that petition was successful. So they're an endangered species, and with that comes designations of critical habitat. Supposedly comes with more protections, but the population continues to decline by about 2.3% each year. So COVID stalled some of the latest population surveys, but we're probably around 260 to 270 whales left. And when they released the status assessment, this is NOAA, last September, they said that because the population is so small and because they're not really sure why the population is decreasing, it doesn't look like recovery is going to happen anytime soon. And the sense that we've been getting from managers from Cook Inlet belugas, I hear all the time, is it's death by 1,000 cuts. And I think that that's pretty true for a lot of species decline. We're seeing salmon starting to collapse, caribou. It's not often just one silver bullet, but if we just got rid of trawling, if we just got rid of this one fishing group, we just did this, everything would be fine. I think it's going to take addressing a lot of different things to make that recovery possible. But we're very concerned about Cook Inlet belugas, and so we have done a lot of partnership work to do 3 kind of main programs around Cook Inlet beluga recovery. So the first is that we are one of the co-founding groups in the Alaska Beluga Monitoring Partnership, now called the Alaska Beluga Monitoring Program under NOAA. And we have trained volunteers who are monitoring for these beluga whales at the mouths of prominent rivers where they're coming in to feed. And so we have dozens of volunteers who are out there in rain and snow and wind, counting those belugas, documenting foraging behavior, documenting human disturbance and noise. And all those data are sent to NOAA, they're reviewed, and are culminate in these reports that NOAA can then use for things like development projects, bank stabilizations at the mouth of a river that belugas use in the spring. We can know kind of what times those belugas are coming in. We also have a text alert system for the Kenai and Kasilof rivers. So when our volunteers see a beluga, we text people where they can see them. And we now have over 400 people on that text alert system.
Wow.
And people who never knew that these endangered belugas were in their backyards are now racing over to the bridge to watch them in the river. It's really amazing. So just building that awareness and building this
wow.
knowledge. And then we have worked with partners also on some more direct advocacy interventions. And the priorities that we've identified for beluga whales, yes, it's death by 1,000 cuts, but some cuts we think run a little bit deeper. And those two cuts are pollution, contamination. The environment is not very healthy.
By extraction industries?
It's also a tricky thing to know. So there's there is oil and gas development. There has been many oil and gas leaks into Cook Inlet in the past years that have gone on for months. So that's one contributing factor. There's sewage treatment and sewage dumping. And then there are things. So Cook Inlet is exempt from EPA water quality standards in these processes called mixing zones. So mixing zones is a permitted area where the pollution can exceed EPA standards.
Why is that?
There are many, what is it? Dilution is the solution to pollution. They basically say that Cook Inlet is turbid enough that it will wash out pollution eventually. We engaged in a process to map all of the threats to beluga whales. And these included shipping routes where boats are going, because they echo, sound is really important to belugas in their hunting. Oil and gas operations, urban and stormwater runoff systems, car tires and things like that. And then these mixing zones of pollution discharge where companies or sewage treatments have these special exemptions and mixing zones, which often overlap. Zones where industrial operators have permits to disturb belugas. There are some of those for oil and gas. And we created this map to just overlay, where are belugas supposed to go where they're not being impacted by these threats. And there's really not many places in Cook Inlet. And so when we were looking about what to do with this, we found that everything was quite siloed. There was some research on water quality here and there and different regulators, and it was just very confusing. So with our partners,
integrated information,
right, really hard to understand, and therefore really hard to know where can we intervene to make water quality better for Cook Inlet, and that's ultimately our goal. And so this fall we're having a comprehensive water quality summit for Cook Inlet, hosted by our partners, to get everyone in the same room and say, okay, what is going on with pollution from this industry? What is the mixing zone status? Just what's the status? What is the health of Cook Inlet, and what can we do to make it better? So we're very excited about that. And it does relate to this, but our second really big advocacy action is prey availability. And there's been research to suggest that if belugas had enough to eat, they might be strong enough to withstand all those other threats. They might be strong enough to withstand the contamination and the noise disturbance and the harassment, all of that. And so we've been working with a fisheries specialist who was on the initial recovery team to figure out what fish species are most important to belugas when to increase their recovery. And so we've submitted a proposal to the Board of Fish to basically reduce the commercial harvest of hooligan in the springtime, so that again we can get more for belugas, because there is no allocation of hooligan for belugas. But we can try and reduce the human allocation and let that trickle down into,
more eagles. Food for them.
More food for them, right? Yeah. And then there are some habitat programs we're doing also concerning beavers, and I think this is an example of how everything is interconnected, right? And on the southern Kenai Peninsula, on one side of Cook Inlet, beavers have been trapped to 20% of their historic population. Basically, 80% of the beavers are gone. There are places like Beaver Flats that no longer have beavers. They've been extirpated from entire river systems. And the area is seeing dramatic changes. There are peatlands that are drying, and as those peatlands dry, they are no longer a fire break. Now we're seeing lightning-caused wildfires on the Kenai Peninsula. We did not see that before. So now there's fires, and those moist sponges of peatlands aren't there to break
absorb,
that up.
But yeah.
Right. Peatlands are incredible for carbon capture. They have a ton of carbon in them that stays out of our atmosphere.
Right.
They're really important moose habitat, berry habitat, and really important for baby fish. We don't really realize how many spawning streams and fish really do need land that is wet and cool. And so we are undergoing a demonstration project in partnership with the Ketchimak Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, University of Alaska, and University of Southern Florida, funded by the Wildlife Conservation Society. We're really excited about it because there was a Board of Game proposal, for example, this year that said, let's just put a 5-year moratorium on beaver trapping. We don't want any beaver trapping for 5 years because they need a chance to come back. And we mobilized a ton of people and agencies to say beavers are important for fish, they're important for moose, they're important for river health, they're important for water temperature cooling because these rivers are getting
Yes.
very warm and they create cool ponds where fish can find refuge. And the proposal failed. And one of the Board of Game members said, I'm on the Board of Game, I'm not on the Board of Fish. And I think it just represents the reasoning for not passing it was because we think of fish as one thing and game as another
Like you
and
said,
birds
it's
as
just
another.
everything's siloed.
Very siloed.
But
And so,
what's unfortunate is that we're not looking at the bigger perspective here, is they are actually supporting these peatlands, the beavers, and
yeah,
they're supporting us by helping to stave off the climate change that's already happening. But
absolutely.
we're
Yeah.
not doing anything to support them.
Yeah. And so I think that it was a very yeah, you nailed it. And so our project with these organizations is to do demonstration projects that actually quantify. We have beaver dams and beaver dam analogs, basically fake beaver dams. But with this, beavers, what is their rate of recharge for drying peatlands? What is the impact of stream temperature when there are beavers there? Um, and what happens around these beaver ponds that happens against the control, which has no beaver pond, and we're seeing that drying. And there has been a lot of research on beaver impacts on peatlands, and we expect that the results will be beneficial. Beavers are a keystone species in this area and therefore are very ecologically important. But even more important, arguably, than quantifying that impact is bringing people to those demonstration sites and saying, see, look at this. Look, I know you say you don't care about fish, but you should because you should care about moose. And there's a moose,
Yeah.
um, like really trying to pull people into that holistic management. And having more beavers could mean having more fish, which could mean more support for belugas. I mean, it's all just so interconnected. And so
Right.
when we're looking at prey availability for belugas, we're looking at commercial fishing regulations, we're looking at the contaminants that are also impacting fish, and we're looking at, what can we do on the habitat end to support fish at a time when the rivers are warming. And there's a lot of complicated stuff that happens in the ocean that we can't protect them from. But what can we do here to help them through our fishing regulations and through our habitat? So,
I
yeah,
appreciate you having that foresight to at least try to have some kind of game plan for what you can do in the area. Like you said, you can't control what's happening in the ocean, but you can support what's happening locally in that inlet.
yeah, and I think there are so many issues that we face. I mean, it's so overwhelming for people who are concerned about climate change, who are concerned about wildlife, because it feels like there's so many things coming at you, and it kind of is that death by a thousand cuts.
Yeah.
But I think it's just trying to strategize around what cuts run deeper, where can we use wildlife as an ally. I mean, beavers,
Yeah.
you just let them go and they'll do their thing. It's great. We don't have to manually dig, and
Right. Right.
they can be a partner in this, right? And
Yeah.
um so I think just bringing us back to a place where we're thinking holistically is really the solution. And the solution to the problem needs to meet this the scale of the solution needs to meet the scale of the problem. So
Yeah.
Doing a couple small things individually always helps, but we really do need this systemic change because the problem is so big.
Right. Right. I like what you mentioned about where are the deeper cuts going because that's where you need to focus. Of course, it's like you feel like you're being hammered every which way because there is
Mhm.
so much information coming in on what's really happening. But like you said, you really have to focus on what we can do to support now for the
Mhm.
future.
Yeah.
And the other part of what AWA does, which is so fantastic, is that you are able to get the public to participate,
Mhm.
which is tremendous to get people motivated and inspired to help create change. Like you had 400 volunteers help with the beluga whales. I think, is that what you mentioned?
Oh yeah, yeah. The program is just growing and growing. We have 400 over 400 people on the text alert system. I don't know off the top of my head how many volunteers we have in Kenai and Kasilof, but it's I mean it's huge. And for people to
Yeah.
give those monitoring sessions are 2 hours, and it is not often sunny and beautiful, and you don't always see whales. I mean, gosh, we have one volunteer who's also a board member who just dutifully watches the Kasilof River, and we've only seen belugas in that river 3 times. And for
Wow.
years, she's out there, and knowing that belugas aren't there is really important. Why aren't they there? Can we do something to get them more food? There's all these questions that come from that data, and we wouldn't know that without
Right.
her individual
Right.
action doing that. And so, um, yeah, I'm just always so humbled by the passion and dedication of our volunteers. There's a
Well,
special
they're
place for them.
Yeah, and they're very necessary. They're an important aspect. They're integral to your work. How do you how do you engage with the public to get them to participate?
Well, COVID changed the game a little bit. It was harder for in-person um, interaction, but we have an email listserv that goes out with opportunities. We call them action alerts. And those are for Alaskans and people who live outside of the state. There are many wildlife issues that happen on federal lands, and therefore any US citizen can comment, and their comment has equal weight. So there's and tourism is such a strong driving force in Alaska. Even just having state agencies and decision makers know that people from outside Alaska are looking at this and care about our wildlife is important. So if you don't live in Alaska, don't feel like you don't have a place here. You absolutely do. Your voice is very important. And so, yeah, our social media, our email listserv, and our website serve as our platform to really get things out. We love talking with people like you who can share the message about what's going on and how to get engaged. It's a lot of word of mouth, and we also have Wildlife Wednesday events where we bring in speakers to talk about different species and engage with people. Then, so it's kind of a myriad of personal connections and digital outreach.
Well, you do a fantastic job because I know that I was signing off for, I believe maybe it was for the wildlife in Kenai.
Oh, great! Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, but I thought that what your outreach is wonderful. Um, I know that we have gone over a little bit, but I would like to just ask you if you, on a high note, can share with listeners about the two big wins for the Kenai brown bear.
Yes, yes. Thanks to people like you commenting. So this is really great. Yes, so Kenai brown bears, up for those who are visual, we're in south central Alaska. It kind of looks like this on a map. We're sort of right in the middle here. Um, and this is actually the brown bear population that originally brought me to AWA. So these bears are have some level of genetic distinction because they're somewhat geographically isolated. And the Kenai Refuge is about a third of the landmass on the Kenai Peninsula. And
That's a
there has
lot.
been, yeah, it's a huge refuge, huge refuge. And the refuge does allow some hunting and trapping. but has never allowed brown bear baiting. And uh, the former chair of the Board of Game, who was the chair for many, many years, lives in that area and was one of the driving voices in this local effort to reduce the brown bear population. There were about 650 bears, brown bears. They wanted more like 200 to 300 just because they didn't, concerns over public safety or, things like that. And so, but the science from both the state and the federal agencies said you can't lower the population that much. It won't be able to sustain it. So, through the Board of Game process, there were many proposals by the public and requests from the Board of Game asking that the Kenai Refuge open itself to brown bear baiting because the surrounding state lands have bear baiting every year. They've expanded the hunting seasons. They've dropped salvage requirements for brown bears. Basically, anything that they can do through state regulations to make it as easy as possible to kill a brown bear. That was kind of the movement in 2013, 2015. So in 2016, the refuge said, we're just going to make this official. We're passing a rule that says we're not allowing brown bear baiting in the refuge. And that's our stance. And we were very supportive of that rule. We mobilized comments in support of the rule. The rule passed. And the state of Alaska and Safari Club sued the refuge and said, you don't have the legal authority to do that. We intervened on behalf of the Fish and Wildlife Service and said, yes, they do. And thus sprung this multi-year legal fight, basically, that went through multiple courts. We won at every level. And just this last spring, the state and Safari Club tried to appeal it to the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. And we were nervous about that. And just because you never want, it was just such a long battle. And this spring, the Supreme Court decided that they would not take up the case that the lower court decision holds, which was in our favor, basically saying that Fish and Wildlife Service had the authority to not have brown bear baiting on the Kenai Refuge. So we officially protected that right of the refuge, essentially, which was a big win. It took a very long time. We were represented. We were a coalition of groups as intervening plaintiffs. We were represented by an amazing pro bono law firm in Alaska called Trustees for Alaska, who do a ton of pro bono litigation for wildlife. We are immensely grateful to them. Highly recommend them. And our coalition partners were great. So that was one of the wins. And so while all of that was working through the courts, we had a very big administration change on the federal level. And the Trump administration and the heads of the agencies that were appointed put down a rule that said it was a Fish and Wildlife Service rule that proposed to open the refuge to brown bear baiting and proposed to take away all of the extra trapping restrictions that the refuge has, which is that you have to label your traps. You can't have visual bait on your traps. You have to check your traps. You can't shoot within a quarter mile of the river. There are certain zones where you can't hunt, and you can't trap within a mile of roads or trailheads. And so it was kind of like a proposal that was sort of eating Fish and Wildlife Service out from the inside. So then we were in a position to oppose that rule. And so we asked for comments, and people like you commented. We had hundreds of thousands of comments against that rule. It was overwhelming. 99.9% of the comments received in the Federal Register were against that rule. Basically, people were saying the refuge is a refuge. We should keep it as a refuge for wildlife. And also, just a couple of months ago, we found out that rule was vacated, meaning that they dropped it. So all that to say, years and years of work and time and money and effort to kind of keep the status quo for bears. And so in some ways that feels a little tough. We want to be more proactive and find ways to improve coexistence, improve keen-eyed brown bear populations. But I think it is a good example in, without watchdogs, without people just tirelessly fighting, there's always going to be these efforts to degrade protections for wildlife and
Right.
ecosystems. And so even though it's a lot of time, and I know people are exhausted with all the things that they're trying to comment on, it really makes a huge difference. I mean, this is millions of acres that is kept as a refuge for these brown bears that otherwise on the peninsula don't have a place. And so we're just so grateful to all the people who commented, to our legal representation, to our partners. It was a big effort. And we were honored to be the lead plaintiff in that because it was something that was really important to us.
Yes, right. I would be honored as well if I was the plaintiff. So thank you for that work, because that was not easy, and it's there's exhaustion from the fight at times.
And it was confusing because on the one hand, we were telling people to support a refuge rule, and then on the other, we were telling to oppose a refuge. It was very confusing.
Yeah.
And we saw a lot of those during that era where there were, we saw it with Pebble Mine. The federal administration was against Pebble Mine. Trump administration became for it and then against it. And it was just, I think people were playing ping pong a little bit.
Right. And it's easily to get confused as to where you're supposed to stand.
Yeah.
What's
and how to
happening here.
comment.
But you guided the way. And, thank goodness. And that there are some pro bono attorneys out there fighting the good fight
Oh, they're great.
for
Trustees
the
for Alaska.
wildlife. That's amazing. That's amazing. I know your work is cut out for you, but thank you for all that you do. I mean, it's not, I don't envy you. I mean, I want to be a voice for the wildlife too. But the work that you do, I mean, you're the boots on the ground, being that spokesperson for that empty chair. And so, I mean, from my heart, I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Last, where can people learn about AWA so that they can follow you and learn more about AWA's work?
Thank you. Our website is akwildlife.org. That's a really good spot to learn about some of our updates. We have blog posts and news. You can learn more about our programs. So that's a really nice centralized hub for that. Also on the website, you can join our newsletter. We promise not to inundate you with emails, only the important ones. And then we're on Facebook and Instagram. You just search Alaska Wildlife Alliance, you'll find us. If you are in Alaska or visiting Alaska, please just give us a call. We love meeting with people, just grabbing a coffee, going out for a walk, learning more about your interests. And if you're outside of Alaska and we really want to know why you care about these wildlife species, and it helps in our efforts to communicate to decision makers why local decisions have a broader impact. And so please reach out. My email is Nicole, which is NICOLE at akwildlife.org. And I'm happy to chat with anyone. So you can find us on all our virtual platforms or come say hello. We would love that.
Oh, you're incredible, Nicole. Thank you.
And thank you so much for doing this podcast. I've learned so much from all the previous speakers, and I feel really lucky to be here. And to the listeners who care about this, there's a lot of things in the world to care about, and I just think that there need to be people in the world speaking for that. Yeah, like I said, that empty chair, and it's always nice to know that there's solidarity, because sometimes these things can feel so overwhelming. So,
for sure.
Appreciate your whole network.
Yeah, exactly. The solidarity is what helps to keep you going too, knowing that other people are wanting the same rights for the voiceless too.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.